300 years had passed since humanity vanished from the galactic stage, and the Great Exodus, as the other species called it, remained one of the galaxy's greatest mysteries, because overnight, every human colony went dark, and every ship stopped transmitting, and every diplomatic channel fell silent, and nobody knew where they went or why they left so suddenly. The Karathi Empire sensed opportunity and quickly claimed the abandoned human worlds, while the insectoid Vrex Collective absorbed human trade routes, and the crystalline Luminari dismissed humanity as another failed species that was too weak to survive the harsh realities of galactic civilization, and they divided everything humans once owned among themselves like it was nothing. And they forgot about humanity, as the years turned into decades, and the decades turned into centuries. But they were wrong about everything. Commander Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Defiant, and it was humanity's first vessel to breach the veil in 3 centuries. And around him his crew worked with practiced efficiency, and their faces were illuminated by holographic displays showing a galaxy that had moved on without them. And Jake felt a mix of anger and determination as he looked at the star maps that showed Karathi symbols where human names should have been. Lieutenant Amy Barrett sat at the navigation console, and her fingers moved across the controls with confidence, and she looked up at Jake and said, "All systems are nominal, and the quantum drives are stable, and we are ready to make our presence known." And behind them, through the veil that had hidden Earth's solar system for 300 years, lay an armada of 7,000 ships, and it was the entire defensive fleet humanity had built during its isolation. And now, they were ready to reclaim what was taken from them. Jake took a deep breath, and his jaw was set with determination as he said, "Send the message and let them know we are back." And the communications officer nodded and transmitted the signal that would change everything, and it went out on all frequencies, to every corner of the galaxy that humans once called home, on the occupied world of New Terra, which was formerly humanity's largest colony. The Karathi governor Zexthar received the transmission with disbelief, and he watched as the holographic image showed a human male wearing a uniform unlike anything in their historical records, and the human spoke with absolute confidence and authority that made Zexthar's mandibles twitch with irritation. The message said, "This is Commander Jake Morrison of the Terran Federation Navy, and 300 years ago humanity withdrew to face an existential threat, and that threat has been neutralized, and we are returning to the galaxy, and we demand the immediate return of all human territories seized during our absence, and you have 72 hours to comply, and this is your only warning." Zexthar's mandibles clicked in what passed for laughter among his kind, and he turned to his military advisor and said, "Send a battle fleet, and 500 ships should be more than enough to handle whatever primitive vessels these returning humans possess." And his advisor hesitated for just a moment before bowing and leaving to carry out the orders, and Zexthar felt confident that this problem would be solved quickly and violently. The Karathi believed that 3 centuries of isolation would have left humanity weak and primitive, and they thought human technology would be outdated, and their ships would be slow, and their weapons would be ineffective, and they had no idea what humanity had been doing during those 300 years, and they had no concept of what was coming for them. Jake watched as the tactical display updated with incoming Karathi fleet positions, and he knew they would come. And he knew they would come with overwhelming force, because that was how the Karathi operated, and they believed in crushing their enemies with superior numbers and brutal efficiency. But Jake had spent years training for this moment, and humanity had spent 3 centuries preparing for this day. Amy looked at the sensor readings and reported that the Karathi 5th Battle Fleet was approaching, and there were 500 combat vessels, and they were arranged in standard attack formation, and they clearly expected an easy victory. And Jake smiled because they had no idea what they were about to face. The crew of the Defiant was calm and focused, and every person at their station knew exactly what to do. And they had trained in simulations for years, and they had studied every tactical scenario, and they were ready for this moment. And Jake felt proud of them as he gave his next orders. He said, "On my mark, we drop the stealth fields, and we show them what humanity has become. And we show them that we are not the weak species they remember. And we show them that 300 years of isolation made us stronger, not weaker." And the crew acknowledged his orders and waited for the command. The Karathi fleet emerged from jump space near the coordinates provided by the human transmission, and Admiral Vektar stood on his command deck expecting to find a handful of outdated vessels crewed by a desperate and technologically backward species, and he was already planning his victory report to the Empress and thinking about the rewards he would receive for crushing this foolish human uprising. But then his sensors started screaming warnings, and the tactical officer shouted that there were multiple contacts and there were too many to count, and the energy signatures were off the charts, and Vector demanded to know what was happening and how many ships the humans had brought. The answer was 7,000 contacts and all military grade and all radiating energy signatures that made the Karathi analysts check their instruments twice and then 3 times because they could not believe what they were seeing, and Vector felt his confidence drain away as he realized that this was not going to be the easy battle he had expected. Jake gave the command and said, "Drop stealth fields now and engage modular separation and show them everything." And across the human fleet, 7,000 ships suddenly appeared on every sensor in the Karathi fleet. And then something happened that made the Karathi realize just how badly they had miscalculated. The Defiant moved forward and then it split apart, and the ship's hull separated into 12 independent fighting units, and each one was bristling with weapons, and each one was capable of independent operation, and across the entire human fleet. The same thing was happening, and 7,000 ships became 40,000 independent fighting units in a matter of seconds. The Karathi had never seen anything like it, and their tactical systems were overwhelmed trying to track so many targets, and Vector shouted orders to engage, but his fleet was already in chaos, and they had trained to fight against concentrated targets, not against swarms of highly mobile attack craft that moved with precision and coordination. Jake watched as the Karathi fleet tried to adapt to the situation, and he felt no satisfaction in what was about to happen, and he had hoped they would listen to the warning, and he had hoped they would withdraw peacefully, but the Karathi had chosen violence. And now they would learn what 300 years of preparation meant for humanity. He gave the order to engage, and the human fleet moved as one, and plasma weapons that burned hotter than any star lit up the darkness of space, and kinetic accelerators fired projectiles at near light speed, and electronic warfare systems infiltrated Karathi networks and turned their own ships against each other. And the battle that the Karathi expected to last hours was over in 6 minutes. Every Karathi ship was crippled, and their engines were destroyed, and their weapons were disabled. But their life support remained intact, and their crews were alive. And Jake had been specific about that because humanity did not return for revenge. And they returned for justice, and there was a difference between the two. Jake stood on the bridge of the Defiant and looked at the disabled Karathi fleet floating helplessly in space, and he felt no joy in the victory because this was not what humanity wanted, and they wanted peace. But they would settle for respect. And now the Karathi would understand that humanity was not asking for permission to reclaim their worlds. He turned to his communications officer and said, "Broadcast on all Karathi channels, and tell your empire that this was our restraint, and tell them that we spared you because we prefer peace, but make absolutely certain they understand that we are not asking for our worlds back, and we are telling you to leave." The message went out across Karathi space, and it reached every military station and every government office and every news network, and within hours the entire Karathi Empire knew that humanity had returned, and they knew that the 5th battle fleet had been utterly defeated in less than 10 minutes, and the shock rippled through their civilization like an earthquake. Amy looked at her console and reported that they were detecting incoming transmissions from 14 different species, and they all wanted to negotiate, and they all wanted to know what humanity's intentions were, and they were all suddenly very interested in talking to the species they had ignored for 3 centuries. Jake smiled grimly and said, "Tell them we will talk, but first the Karathi leave New Terra and actions before words." And he wanted to make it clear that humanity would not be distracted by empty diplomatic promises, and they wanted to see real change before they would sit down at any negotiation table. On the Karathi homeworld, the Empress convened an emergency session of her war council, and the footage from the battle played on holographic displays, and it showed human ships moving through her fleet like predators among prey, and every tactical analyst who watched the footage came to the same conclusion, which was that the Karathi Empire could not win a war against humanity. The Empress demanded to know where the humans got this technology and how they had advanced so far in just 3 centuries, and her chief scientist, who was an elderly Karathi named Pelmoth, brought up data files recovered from ancient human databases, and he explained what he had discovered. Pelmoth said 300 years ago, humanity detected something approaching their space, and it was something vast and hostile. And instead of fighting and failing, they hid, and they pulled a veil of quantum distortion around their core systems. and vanished from our sensors, and while we thought they were gone, they were actually right there preparing for war. The Empress leaned forward and asked what they were preparing for, and Pelmuth displayed images from human data fragments, and he said they fought something in that hidden space, and for 300 years with no external conflicts and no trade, dependencies and no distractions, humanity did nothing but advance their technology and build weapons, and they fought an entity that we never even detected. The War Council fell silent as they absorbed this information, and one of the generals asked if the humans won against this entity, and Pelmuth nodded and said, "They must have, because they are here now, and they are stronger than ever, and whatever they fought it made them into something far more dangerous than the species we remember." The Empress's mandibles drooped in a gesture of defeat, and she asked what kind of species hides for 3 centuries just to return stronger. And Pelmuth replied that it was a patient species, and a very, very dangerous species, and one that the Karathi Empire should not antagonize further. Within 2 days, the Karathi began evacuating New Terra, and their ships left orbit carrying soldiers and administrators and colonists who had lived on the human world for generations, and they moved quickly because nobody wanted to test humanity's patience, and nobody wanted to see what would happen if they refused the demand. The Vrex Collective watched the Karathi retreat and made their own calculations, and they decided to abandon the human trade routes they had claimed, and the crystalline luminari who had never bent to any species quietly removed their mining operations. From human asteroid belts and across the galaxy, every species that had taken human territory began giving it back. Captain Lisa Grant commanded the diplomatic vessel Horizon, and it was humanity's first official contact ship built for conversation, not combat, though it carried enough defensive systems to make any aggressor think twice, and she was approaching the Galactic Council Station, where representatives from 40 different species waited to meet with humanity. Her pilot, who was Lieutenant Chris Hayes, announced that they were receiving welcome messages in 15 languages, and the Council was trying very hard to appear friendly and accommodating, and Lisa knew it was because they were afraid of what humanity might do next. Beside Lisa stood Dr. Nathan Cole, who was humanity's new chief diplomat, and he had spent years studying the galactic political landscape from archived data, and he understood how the Council worked, and he knew that they respected strength above all else. Nathan said quietly, "Remember, we are not here to dominate, and we are here to establish boundaries and make it clear that humanity will not be pushed around again." And Lisa nodded because she understood that this meeting would set the tone for all future human relations with the galaxy. The council chamber was vast and designed to accommodate representatives from 40 different species, and as Lisa and Nathan entered, every eye and stalk and sensor and optical organ turned to face them, and Lisa felt the weight of their attention, and she knew that everyone in this room was trying to figure out what humanity would demand. Chairman Velkos was a towering member of the Thalen species, and he gestured for them to approach and said, "Humans, you have returned with considerable force, and the council wishes to understand your intentions," and his tone was careful and diplomatic, but Lisa could hear the underlying tension. Nathan stepped forward, and his voice was calm but firm as he said, "Our intentions are simple, and we want peace, but we will defend ourselves and our interests, and for 300 years the galaxy divided our territories among yourselves, like we were extinct, and we are rectifying that situation." Counselor Zira of the Luminari spoke next, and her crystalline form refracted light in beautiful patterns as she said, "Your military display was quite alarming, and do you intend to conquer?" And there was genuine concern in her voice because the Luminari had seen empires rise and fall, and they knew the signs of an aggressive, expanding civilization. Lisa interjected and said, "No, we do not intend to conquer, but we intend to ensure no one conquers us. And humanity learned a hard lesson 3 centuries ago when we faced an enemy alone, and we survived and we adapted and we grew stronger, and now we are back and we are offering the galaxy a choice." She continued and said, "Work with us as equals or stay out of our way." And there was no threat in her voice, just a simple statement of fact, and the council members shifted uncomfortably because they were used to being the power brokers and the decision makers, and now this returning species was telling them how things would be. A Karathi delegate who had been sitting quietly in the back spoke up, and his voice was bitter as he asked, "And if we refuse, and what will you do? If we refuse your terms?" And Nathan turned to look at him, and his expression did not change. Nathan said, "Then you will be choosing a very difficult path, and we do not want enemies, but we have spent 300 years preparing for the worst, and peace is our preference and isolation is acceptable. but subjugation. And he paused for emphasis and said never again. Chairman Velko studied the two humans for a long moment, and the chamber was so quiet that Lisa could hear the hum of the environmental systems. And finally he said, "You speak of equality, yet you arrive with overwhelming military force," and it seemed like an accusation, but Nathan was ready for it. Nathan replied, "We learned from you, and every species on this council maintains a military, and the Karathi conquered 16 species before facing any resistance, and the Vrex collective operates through economic domination, backed by fleet strength, and the Luminari may preach enlightenment, but your ships carry weapons too, and we are not naive, and we know respect in this galaxy comes from strength." Lisa added, "We watched from our archives, and we studied how this galaxy works, and we saw what happens to species that are weak or divided or unprepared, and we decided we would never be any of those things. And now we are here, and we want to participate in galactic civilization, but on our terms." Chairman Velkos nodded slowly after a long silence and said the council will deliberate, and in the meantime humanity's territorial claims are recognized, and you may establish trade relations and diplomatic channels and military treaties as you see fit. And it was a victory even though it did not feel like one, because humanity was simply taking back what had always been theirs. As Lisa and Nathan left the chamber, Chris was waiting with a smile and asked how it went, and Lisa replied, "We are not at war, and I will take that as a win." And the three of them walked back to the horizon knowing that they had just changed the course of galactic history forever. But not everyone in the galaxy accepted humanity's return with diplomatic grace, and in the lawless frontier sectors, pirate fleets and mercenary groups saw opportunity, because if they could capture human technology, they could sell it to the highest bidder and make themselves rich beyond imagination. Captain Ryan Foster commanded the cargo vessel Meridian, and it was one of the first civilian ships to venture beyond reclaimed human space, and his crew of 30 were volunteers and pioneers eager to restart trade relationships that had been dormant for 3 centuries, and Ryan knew the risks, but he also knew that humanity could not hide forever. Helen Price was his sensor operator, and she sat at her console watching the display with practiced attention, and suddenly she said, "Contact bearing 270 and multiple ships, and no identification codes and configuration matches, known pirate vessels," and Ryan felt his stomach tighten because he had hoped to avoid trouble on this first run. He asked how many, and Helen replied 12, and "Looks like they are trying to surround us," and Ryan looked at his crew and saw that they were nervous but not panicking, because every human who went into space now trained for combat situations, and they all knew what to do. The pirates in the frontier sectors had grown bold over the centuries, and most species paid ransoms or lost cargo, rather than risk their lives in combat, and they expected the same from these returning humans, and they thought this cargo ship would be easy prey, and they were about to learn a very different lesson. Ryan said, "Activate defensive systems and communications, send a warning to those ships and tell them to alter course or face consequences," and the communications officer sent the message. But Ryan already knew what the response would be, because pirates did not listen to warnings and they only understood force. The pirate response was predictable, and plasma bolts streaked toward the Meridian, and they were expecting to disable the engines and force a surrender like they had done to hundreds of other ships over the years. But instead, something unexpected happened that made the pirate captains realize they had made a terrible mistake. The cargo ship's hull plating shimmered with energy and absorbed the attacks like they were nothing, and point defense lasers that had been hidden in what appeared to be standard sensor arrays shot down incoming missiles with perfect accuracy, and the Meridian did not even slow down. Ryan muttered, "Guess they want to do this the hard way," and said, "Helm pattern Delta, and let us show them what a human cargo ship can do." And the pilot grinned and pushed the controls forward, and the Meridian accelerated not away from the pirates but directly toward them. The pirates were confused by this aggressive move from what should have been easy prey, and they tried to scatter and break formation, but they were too slow and too disorganized, and they had never faced an opponent that fought back with such confidence and capability. The cargo ship's sides opened and revealed missile tubes, and they were not military-grade weapons, but they were powerful enough, and each missile locked onto a pirate vessel with targeting systems that would have made military artificial intelligence jealous, and the pirates realized too late that this was not a helpless freighter. Helen reported direct hit on 6 targets, and the others are retreating, and Ryan opened a channel to the fleeing pirates and said, "This is Captain Ryan Foster of the Terran merchant vessel Meridian, and go back to whatever hole you crawled from. and spread the word that human ships are not soft targets. He continued and said, "We spent 300 years learning to defend ourselves and test us again, and we will not be this merciful." And the pirates fled into jump space, and Ryan knew they would spread the story, and other pirates would hear it and think twice before attacking human vessels. News of the encounter spread through the frontier sectors within days, and other merchant captains from various species heard the story with disbelief, because a cargo ship had defeated a pirate fleet, and that was not supposed to be possible, and it changed everything they thought they knew about commerce and defense. Captain Zora was a Rex trader who had been working the frontier for decades, and she brought the news to a trading post meeting and said, "I am telling you, these humans are different from what the old records show, and every ship, even their civilian vessels, are built for combat, and you cannot treat them like the other species." Another trader who was a Thalen named Court said, "It makes sense when you think about it, because they spent 3 centuries isolated and facing some unknown threat, and they could not afford to have weak ships, and every vessel had to be able to defend itself, and that is just smart survival." Zora replied, "It changes everything, and the old trade routes and the old deals where stronger species could pressure weaker ones for better terms, and none of that works if humanity refuses to play by those rules, and we have to adapt or we will lose business to human merchants." Back on Earth, Admiral Kate Sullivan reviewed reports from across reclaimed human space, and every day brought new encounters and new tests of humanity's resolve, and every day the message became clearer that humanity was not just back, but had evolved into something far more capable than anyone expected. Her aide, who was Lieutenant Paul Grant, reported that they were receiving requests from 6 different species, and they want to establish mutual defense pacts, and Kate raised an eyebrow, because 2 weeks ago, they were taking our territory, and now they want protection. Paul explained that the frontier is getting dangerous, and with humanity refusing to be pushed around, some of the more aggressive species are looking for easier targets, and the smaller nations are getting nervous, and they see humanity as potential protectors. Kate considered this carefully and said, "Tell them we are open to discussions, but make it clear that any pact we sign will be between equals, and we are not their military force for hire, and we are not interested in building an empire, and we defend our interests and our allies, but we do not conquer." Paul acknowledged the orders and left, and Kate turned to look at the holographic display of the galaxy, and saw so many species and so many potential friends and enemies, and she thought about how 300 years ago, humanity had been scattered and unprepared and vulnerable. She whispered to herself, "Never again," and meant it with every fiber of her being, because humanity had paid the price for weakness once, and they would not pay it again, and the galaxy would learn to respect them or learn to fear them, and either way, humanity would survive. On a distant frontier world, a small colony of mixed species watched as human engineers arrived to help repair their damaged infrastructure, and the colony had been raided by pirates 3 times in the past year, and the local government had no resources to defend itself, and they had asked humanity for help. The human engineers worked alongside the locals and showed them how to build better defenses, and how to set up early warning systems, and how to organize their own protection, and they did not charge massive fees or demand political concessions, and they simply helped because it was the right thing to do. A young colonist asked one of the engineers why humanity was helping them, and the engineer, whose name was Danny Martinez, said, "Because we know what it is like to be vulnerable, and we know what it is like to face threats alone, and we decided that if we have the power to help, then we should help." The young colonist looked at Danny with something like wonder in their eyes and said, "You are very different from the other powerful species," and Danny smiled and replied, "That is because we learned our lessons the hard way, and we will not become the thing we fought against," and humanity remembered what it was like to be alone and afraid. 6 months had passed since humanity's return to the galaxy, and the initial shock had faded into a new normal, where human ships patrolled their territory, and human diplomats negotiated treaties, and human merchants established trade routes that had been dead for 3 centuries, and the galaxy was adjusting to this new reality. Dr. Sarah Mitchell stood before the Galactic Science Council and prepared to present research that had been developed during humanity's isolation, and she knew this presentation could change how the galaxy viewed humanity, because military might made others fear you, but scientific advancement made them respect you, and respect was what humanity needed most. She said, "What we are proposing is a joint research initiative, and humanity developed these medical technologies out of necessity, but they have applications across multiple species, and the holographic display behind her showed revolutionary treatments that made the assembled scientists lean forward with interest. The display showed regenerative therapies that could regrow limbs and neural interfaces that could restore damaged cognitive function and disease eradication protocols that worked across different biological systems, and Sarah watched as the scientists from dozens of species studied the data with growing excitement. Counselor Zira of the Luminari studied the data, and her crystalline form pulsed with light as she said, "These advances are remarkable, and you developed all of this during your isolation." And there was genuine admiration in her voice, because even the Luminari, who were among the most advanced species, had not achieved some of these breakthroughs. Sarah explained that when you are cut off from the galaxy with limited resources, you learn to maximize what you have, and we could not afford to lose people to preventable injuries or diseases, so we found solutions, and necessity drove innovation in ways that comfort never could. A Vrek scientist whose compound eyes reflected the holographic data asked, "And you are willing to share this?" And there was disbelief in his voice because most species guarded their technological advantages jealously and used them for political leverage. Sarah said, "For a price, and not money or territory, but knowledge exchange, and share your advances in your fields and we will share ours." And humanity is not interested in hoarding technology because we are interested in building relationships, and that is worth more than any temporary advantage. It was a calculated move that the human leadership had debated for weeks, and military might made others fear you, and economic power made them need you. But scientific cooperation made them respect you and value you, and humanity was playing the long game. On New Terra, the first mixed species settlement was being established, and humans worked alongside Karathi and Thalin, and even a few Luminari, to build something that had never existed before, which was a truly integrated community where different species lived and worked as equals. Admiral Jake Morrison, who had been promoted after the successful return, walked through the construction site with Governor Lisa Grant, who had transitioned from her diplomatic role to overseeing the colony, and they both felt proud of what was being built here. Lisa said humans and Karathi and Thalin and even a few Luminari, and a year ago, I would have said this was impossible. But here we are building something new together, and Jake nodded because he understood that this was just as important as any military victory. A young Karathi worker approached them and her mandibles clicked nervously as she said, "Admiral Morrison, I wanted to thank you, and my hive was stationed here when you returned, and you could have killed us all, but you showed mercy, and that mercy gave my Empress time to reconsider her position." Jake placed a hand on her shoulder in a gesture he had learned was reassuring to Karathi, and said, "We did not come back for revenge, and we came back for our home. And there is a difference between those two things, and we want to build a future, not destroy one." As they continued walking, Lisa spoke quietly and asked, "Do you think it will last in this peace we have built?" And Jake was silent for a moment before answering because it was a question he had asked himself many times. He replied, "Nothing lasts forever. But we have laid a foundation, and we showed. We are strong enough to defend ourselves, but we are also showing we are valuable partners. And that is the balance we need to maintain. And as long as we keep that balance, we have a chance." Back in the Terran Federation capital, which had been re-established on Earth, President Andrew Mason prepared to address the Global Assembly, and his speech would be broadcast across human space and transmitted to diplomatic channels throughout the galaxy. He stood before the assembled representatives and began speaking and said, 300 years ago, our ancestors faced an impossible choice, and they could fight an enemy they did not understand and likely lose everything, or they could hide and prepare for a future where they might survive. He continued and said they chose survival, and they chose sacrifice, and every generation born during our isolation grew up knowing they might never see the stars beyond our veil. But they worked anyway, and they built anyway, and they dreamed of this day when humanity would return to the galaxy. The president's voice grew stronger as he said, "Now we are back, and the galaxy is watching to see what humanity will do with its second chance. And some species fear us, and some seek to use us, and some respect us. And all of those reactions are natural and understandable." He said, "But I want to make one thing perfectly clear, and humanity's goal is not domination, and it is not revenge, and it is not isolation. And our goal is to build a future where no species, human or otherwise, has to face extinction alone." Andrew, explained that we learned hard lessons during our absence, and we learned that strength without wisdom is dangerous, and that technology without ethics is destructive, and that survival without purpose is merely existence. And we returned to this galaxy, not as conquerors, but as a species that has been tested. He said we offer our hand in partnership to those who want it, and we offer our strength to defend those who need it, and we offer our knowledge to advance the entire galactic community. And these are not empty promises, but commitments we intend to keep. But then his voice became firm, and he said, make no mistake, and humanity will not be subjugated again, and we will not be dismissed, and we will not be victims, and we are here to stay, and the galaxy cannot stop us, and nor should it want to, because when humanity thrives, we lift others with us. The transmission ended, and across the galaxy, billions of beings from hundreds of species considered the message, and some received it with hope, and some with fear, and some with careful calculation as they tried to figure out how this affected their own interests. But all of them knew one absolute truth, which was that the galaxy had changed and humanity was back, and nothing would ever be the same again. And the question now was not whether humanity would survive, but what kind of civilization they would build. In the observation deck of the Defiant, Jake and Lisa stood side by side, watching Earth rotate below them and around the planet. Thousands of ships moved in ordered patterns, and it was a testament to humanity's new place in the galaxy. Lisa asked, quietly, do you think we did the right thing in coming back with such overwhelming force? And Jake considered the question carefully before answering, because it was something that weighed on him. Jake said 300 years ago, we were scattered and weak and taken for granted, and when we disappeared, the galaxy carved up our territory without a second thought. And if we had returned quietly and asked nicely for what was ours, would they have listened? And Lisa shook her head and said, probably not. He continued and said, then we did what we had to do. And we showed strength first and then offered partnership, because fear opens doors and respect keeps them open, and genuine cooperation builds something lasting, and that is the path we chose. Lisa smiled and asked, when did you become a philosopher? And Jake grinned and replied, when I spent 300 subjective years in cryo-sleep having weird dreams. But seriously, we are pioneers again, and not just for humanity, but for a new kind of galactic civilization. He explained that we are building a civilization where might does not make right, but where weakness does not make you prey either. And it is a balance. And Lisa said, exactly, and they both understood that maintaining that balance would be the work of generations. Below them, Earth continued its eternal rotation, and it was a world that had hidden itself to survive and emerged transformed. And around them, the galaxy buzzed with activity, as species negotiated and traded and researched and slowly, carefully, learned to see humanity not as a threat or a victim, but as an equal. On a research station orbiting Jupiter, Dr. Kevin Hughes worked alongside scientists from 6 different species, and they were collaborating on a project to improve jump drive efficiency, and it was the kind of cooperation that would have been impossible just months ago. A luminary scientist named Shara worked at the console next to Kevin, and she said, your approach to quantum field manipulation is fascinating, and we have been trying to solve this problem for decades, and you found a solution in isolation. And Kevin replied that sometimes limitations force creativity. He explained that we did not have access to certain rare materials during our isolation, so we had to find alternatives, and sometimes those alternatives turned out to be better than the original, and Shara's crystalline form pulsed with what Kevin had learned was amusement. She said there is wisdom in that, and perhaps the galaxy has been too comfortable with abundance and we stopped innovating because we did not have to. And Kevin nodded and said, that is exactly what happened to us before we went into isolation, and we got comfortable and almost paid the ultimate price. On the frontier world of Cascade, a human merchant named Victor Kane was negotiating a trade agreement with a coalition of smaller species, and they were offering raw materials in exchange for defensive technology and medical supplies, and Victor knew this deal would set a precedent. The coalition leader, who was a small furry creature named Pip, said, we hear that humanity offers fair terms and that you do not exploit weaker partners, and is this true or just propaganda? And Victor smiled because he appreciated the direct question. He said, it is true, and we charge fair prices and we honor our agreements, and we do not use military pressure to influence trade deals because we remember what it was like to be vulnerable, and we will not become the thing we fought against. Pip studied Victor carefully and said, many species say such things, but few mean them, and how do we know you are different? And Victor replied, "You do not know for certain, but we are willing to prove ourselves, and we propose a small initial trade, and if we honor our terms, then we expand and trust must be earned." The coalition discussed among themselves, and finally Pip said, "We accept your terms and we will start small and see if humanity's actions match their words." And Victor nodded and thought that this was exactly how it should be, because trust took time to build. Back on Earth, in the Federation military headquarters, Admiral Kate Sullivan met with her senior staff to discuss the long-term strategy for maintaining peace and security, and they all knew that the current situation was fragile and required careful management. General Craig Foster, who commanded the ground forces, said, "We have successfully reclaimed all human territory and established defensive perimeters. But the question is, what comes next, and how do we prevent another 300-year crisis?" Kate replied, "We prevent it by being prepared and by maintaining our technological edge, and by building alliances with species that share our values, and most importantly, by never becoming complacent again, because complacency is what made us vulnerable before." Colonel Nina Ross, who headed intelligence operations, said, "We are detecting increased cooperation between some of the more aggressive species, and they are trying to understand our technology and our tactics, and we should assume they will eventually develop countermeasures." Kate nodded and said, "That is expected, and we are not trying to maintain permanent superiority, but rather establish a balance where attacking humanity is not worth the cost, and where cooperation offers more benefits than conflict, and that is sustainable in a way that domination is not." On New Terra, young people from different species attended the first integrated school, and human children sat next to Karathi hatchlings and Thalen youngsters, and they learned together and played together, and slowly began to see each other not as alien species but as classmates and friends. A human teacher named Ellen Brooks watched her diverse classroom and felt hope for the future, because these children would grow up without the prejudices and fears of their parents, and they would build relationships that cross species lines, and that was worth more than any treaty or alliance. One of her students, who was a Karathi named Crix, raised a claw and asked, "Why did humans come back with so many warships if they wanted peace?" And Ellen thought carefully about how to answer, because it was a complex question. She said, "Imagine you had a home and you had to leave it to face a danger. And when you were gone, other people moved into your home and took your things. And when you came back, would you knock politely and hope they left? Or would you show them you were strong enough to take back what was yours?" Crix thought about this and said, "I would show strength first, but then offer peace." And Ellen smiled and said, "Exactly. And that is what humanity did, and now we are here learning together and building friendships, and that is the peace part." In the galactic core, the ancient species known as the Architects watched humanity's return with interest because they had existed for millions of years and seen countless civilizations rise and fall, and they recognized something special in humanity's approach. The Architect Observer, whose name was unpronounceable to most species, sent a message to the human leadership and said, "We have watched your return with great interest, and your approach to galactic civilization is unique, and we wish to open diplomatic relations." President Andrew Mason received the message with surprise because the Architects rarely involved themselves in galactic affairs, and their interest was significant, and he knew that having their respect could change everything for humanity. He replied, "We would be honored to establish relations with the Architects, and we have much to learn from a civilization as ancient as yours, and we hope we can find common ground." And the response came quickly. The Architect Observer said, "You have already demonstrated the qualities we value most, which are resilience and adaptability, and the wisdom to know when to fight and when to cooperate, and we believe humanity will become a stabilizing force in this galaxy." Jake stood on the bridge of the Defiant 1 year after humanity's return, and looked at the tactical display that showed human ships patrolling their territory, and merchant vessels traveling trade routes and diplomatic vessels visiting alien worlds, and he felt satisfied with what they had accomplished. Amy reported that all sectors are secure and we have no hostile contacts and trade is flowing smoothly, and our allies report feeling safer with our defensive pacts. And Jake nodded and thought that this was what success looked like. Lisa joined him on the bridge and said, "We did it, and we brought humanity back, and we reclaimed our place in the galaxy, and we are building something that will last." And Jake smiled and replied, "We are still building, and we will always be building, because that is what humanity does." The age of humanity's return had truly begun, and the galaxy would never stop them, because stopping humanity was no longer the question, And the question now was, how far could they all go together? And the answer, like humanity itself, was still being written among the stars, and it was a story of strength and wisdom and hope for a better future.